Okay, hello everyone. We'll start when everybody is admitted to the room. Okay, we'll go ahead and begin. Welcome to our webinar, Building Climate Justice, Safe and Healthful Transportation and Housing. Before we begin, all of us at the Medical Society Consortium on Climate and Health respectfully acknowledge that our advocacy, education, and learning across the country takes place on the occupied and unceded lands of many Native American tribes. To acknowledge this land is to recognize its long history and our place in that history. It's to recognize these lands and waters and their significance for the people who lived and continue to live in this country and whose practices and spiritualities were, are, and shall always be tied to the land and the water. Today's webinar is the 7th in our 2022 Climate Justice webinar series as part of the Climate and Health Equity Fellowship Program. The CHEF Fellowship, as we call it, is a program that recognizes the need for more diversity in climate and health leadership and a sharper focus on equitable climate solutions. The goal of the fellowship is to empower doctors of color from populations that face greater burdens from climate effects and are underrepresented in medicine to become leaders in climate and health equity education, advocacy, and policy solutions. I'm Dr. Mark Mitchell, the program director. Also joining me from the consortium to run this webinar is our program assistant, Clarissa Payton, and Jordan Curry Carter, our program manager. Clarissa will be available throughout the chat, through the chat to answer any technical questions during the webinar. Our other team members on the webinar are Dr. Venice Curry, the Western Associate Director of Climate and Health Equity Fellowship Program, and our program manager, Dr. Kimberly Williams. This webinar series is hosted by the Medical Society Consortium on Climate and Health and is held for 1 hour on the second Friday of each month from 3 to 4 p.m. Eastern. Today's webinar will be recorded and made available on our website for future viewing as part of our Equity Resources page on the consortium website. Today, we're honored to have Maria Cecilia Pinto deMoura, Senior Vehicles Engineer in the Clean Transportation Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists, as well as Rahwa Ghirmatzion, the Executive Director at Push Buffalo. Rather than using a time to provide further description of their impressive work, we're going to place a link of their bios in the chat. As healthcare providers, it's important that you consider the roles that healthcare systems and providers play in regard to climate and health. In this webinar, Cecilia Pinto deMoura will speak on the health impacts as well as some key points from the Inflation Reduction Act to decarbonize transportation. She'll also focus on how new technologies can be accessible to and benefit low wealth communities and communities of color. Rahwa will discuss the barriers to weatherization for low income people and what Push Buffalo has done to overcome these barriers and to provide equitable solutions. The general format for today's webinar will be 2 20-minute presentations by our speakers, followed by 10 minutes of questions and answers from our audience. We ask that you put comments, links to any resources that you may recommend, or any questions that you may have for the presenters in the chat box at any time during these presentations. We'll get to as many of the questions as we can during the question and answer period. Please keep yourself muted so we're not interrupted by background noise. So Cecilia, you may begin. Okay, we see the presentation.
Good. Okay, so I'd like to start with this basic slide, which I've already shown a subset of some of you earlier on, which is the importance of the importance of the relationship between reducing greenhouse gas emissions and reducing local pollution. Two very different kinds of emissions. And the interaction between these two kinds of emissions is very complex. So greenhouse gases are the cause of global warming, and carbon dioxide is the major part. In this country, it's about 80%. Methane is about 10%, but is a more powerful greenhouse gas. And then there are others, fluorinated gases, nitrous oxide. You can see these in the pie chart on the left. Now, the criteria air pollutants, which are PM 2.5, nitrogen dioxide, and other nitrogen oxides, ozone, sulfur dioxide, carbon monoxide, and lead, are local pollutants emitted directly by tailpipes. And the point I want to make here is that when you control for greenhouse gases, you're also controlling for criteria air pollutants because they are co-emitted. In other words, when you reduce CO2 emissions from a tailpipe of a car, you are also reducing the PM 2.5, nitrous oxide, etc. So the policies are very interrelated. In other words, you might not even have a control for a particular matter, but you will be controlling anyway if you control for greenhouse gases. So that's the point I want to make here. It's a very important point. Now, transportation is the largest share in the economy of greenhouse gases. It's a little over a quarter. And within transportation, cars and light trucks are the biggest contribution, over half. Trucks and buses are about a quarter. And sometimes people are amazed that aircraft and rail, ships and boats are actually a pretty small percentage compared to on-road vehicles. So of course, we have to address all of these. For aircraft, we have sustainable aviation fuel, we have other technologies for rail, ships and boats. But what I'm concerned with now, which is what most of my research has been recently, is on reducing greenhouse gas emissions from trucks, buses, cars, and light trucks. So this is a study that we did at UCS, and what you see here, that black line up on top, is emissions, CO2 emissions from transportation. From the entire economy. The black line up on top, and the wedges are reductions of CO2 from each of the economic sectors. So the red wedge there is transportation emission reductions. The green wedge is electricity. So what I want to show with this slide is the relative importance of reducing electricity and transportation emissions. So if you look at the green wedge, which is electricity, there is more of a reduction in the near term, right? So that by 2030, we have about 75% of all reductions in the economy come from electricity. And the reason for that is that we're phasing out coal and replacing it primarily with solar and wind. And by the way, solar and wind provide about 60% of US electricity by 2030 and 90% by 2050. So as time goes on, we continue to clean the power grid. But as you see, the green wedge just stays about the same. In other words, the contribution is about the same. And transportation, the reductions from transportation increase a lot relative to electricity. And so by 2050, the sector that is reducing the most emissions is the transportation sector. 38% by in 2050. The reductions come from transportation. In other words, the transportation sector is extremely important. Of course, the electricity sector is important as well, but the two are going to go hand in hand. So the reductions from both the cleaning of the grid and cleaning of the transportation sector are really important. So let's move on. So how do we do this, right? How do we achieve, such an incredible amount of emission reductions from transportation? So there are 4 ways, right? Electrification is the main strategy, and to get to those emission reductions that I showed in the previous graph, we have to only be selling zero emission vehicles. By 2035, passenger vehicles, and by 2040, medium and heavy trucks have to be entirely zero emission. In other words, for trucks, it could be fuel cell as well as electric, right? Zero emission is different from ZEV is different from battery electric. It means both battery electric and fuel cell. So the second strategy is vehicle efficiency. In other words, that's to do with the vehicle technology, and it's a question of how the motor uses the fuel, and we're just using a smaller amount of fuel for the same service. In other words, the same number of miles, and that goes for both electric cars. The electricity as a fuel is the efficiency is improving, as well as for gas-powered cars, which will still be on the road for quite a while, because we're just making sales 100% by 2035, right? There's still going to be a fleet. Cars last 15 years or more. And then the third strategy is clean liquid fuels, because by 2050, we will still have a significant number of internal combustion engine vehicles on the road, and they will still be burning fuel. And so we have to make sure they're burning cleaner fuels if we want to be decarbonizing by 2050. And the fourth strategy has nothing to do with vehicle or fuel technology. It is all about changing how our society and how we behave. In other words, we need to, of course, there has to be government planning here. We have to have more public transportation, but we also have to get people to get out of their cars as much as possible, use more public transportation, use biking, active transportation, walking, congestion control, and various other, make transportation more affordable as well as more accessible, so that disadvantaged, overburdened and underserved communities can have more affordable and more accessible public transportation. So that's the fourth, and very, very important. It's not just about, this transition is huge, very significant, expensive, but I'll talk about costs later. The vehicle and fuel technology are important, but we have to also have this societal and individual transition going on along with it. Okay, so electrification is by far the most important, because that is really how we're going to clean up the air, right? And what I wanted to show you here is the bar on the left shows the global warming emissions, that's greenhouse gases, from a gasoline car. It's the gray bar. And the red part there at the bottom is the cost of manufacturing the vehicle, right? Now, the next bar to the right, I don't know if you can see my arrow, this one, is an electric car that provides the same service as the gasoline car. And look how the total emissions is much smaller. It's a 52% reduction. And the reduction has to do with a reduction of the vehicle operation, which means fuel. That's the gray part. Notice that the vehicle manufacturing is not much more. It's about the same. It's the orange bar, and the purple bar is the manufacturing of the battery, right? Which is about the same as emits about the same. This is not cost, right? This is about global warming emissions. So this surprises a lot of people who think that battery manufacturing is, emits a lot of greenhouse gases, but it emits about the same as manufacturing the car itself. And if you look at a truck, a gasoline truck and an electric truck, the reduction is also pretty dramatic, 57%. So this is just to put into perspective why it is that electric cars are so important for reducing emissions. Now, the main result of the study that I mentioned earlier on that we did at UCS, along with Evolved Energy Research, we did a big modeling project to decarbonize the entire economy by 2050. And I'm just presenting the results of the transportation part here. So one of the main results is that we can cut fuel use by 84% between now and 2050 with only those strategies that I mentioned: electrification, efficiency, clean fuels, and mobility strategies. Notice that diesel and gasoline decrease a lot because we are, after all, substituting those for electric cars, but jet fuel stays the same because aviation is a very hard to decarbonize area. And so we will still need by 2050, look at the share of jet fuel. Share of jet fuel today is very small, right? Like 10% perhaps, but in 2050, it's 2/3. So the importance of clean fuels comes in. Okay, so we have to decarbonize those fuels in 2050. And there will also be long distance trucks that are still on the road. And so we need various policies to clean up those fuels. And I think I'm going to talk about that a little later. Yeah, I'll mention those. So here are the hard to decarbonize sectors: long distance freight, aviation, and shipping. So to clean up that small amount, it's not that small actually, 16% of what we use today by 2050, we need clean fuel standards. So we need standards that will hold fuel producers accountable to steadily reduce the life cycle emissions of all transportation fuels. And today we have the renewable fuel standard, but the renewable fuel standard does not take electrification into account. So we have to go beyond that. We have to have biofuel policies that have an effect on electrification. And so the clean fuel standards that decrease the carbon intensity of fuels are very important, because then electrification counts as a very low carbon or zero carbon fuel. And right now, California and Oregon have existing clean fuel standards that are working and being strengthened. And in Washington, this new standard is being implemented. So that's about cleaning up the liquid fuels. Then there are different ways of producing these fuels as well, right? We can produce synthetic fuels, for instance, from hydrogen, right? You just take molecules of hydrogen and carbon, and through various thermochemical and other kinds of processes, we produce a hydrocarbon molecule. But we have to be really careful for many reasons there. One is we have to make sure that the hydrogen that we use, because the hydrogen that's used to produce synthetic fuels comes from electrolysis. In other words, you take electricity and you break up water to get hydrogen and oxygen. but you have to make sure that that electricity is renewable, because if we're producing hydrogen from a dirty source of electricity, that kind of half defeats the purpose, right? So synthetic fuels have a lot of potential, but also we have to be very careful with how these biofuels also, we have to be very careful. There are a lot of issues to do with competition with food. So those are issues that are, I'm not going to get into, but certainly must be taken into account so that they don't harm the communities where we're farming biofuel for biofuels, for instance, is happens.
So we have about 2 minutes.
2 minutes. Oh boy. I'm going to talk about the Inflation Reduction Act. This law will raise $373 billion and for climate and energy. And we have some blogs that you can read, so I don't have to talk about them, but there's an environmental justice, all the environmental justice advances. There's the climate and energy. And I wanted to talk about how it's going to accelerate the electrification of from diesel and gasoline to electricity. And I wanted to talk about the I don't know if I have time now, Mark, but the tax credits are going to continue, but there's some major changes. Many are better for the better. So the manufacturer cap of 200,000 EVs has been eliminated. The $7,500 for qualifying for new EVs has new qualifications. So now you have to have cars that are cheaper, and they don't include luxury models. There are critical mineral and battery component requirements also. And now this is really huge. We have a credit for used EVs, $4,000 for used EVs. And we have an income cap for eligibility. In other words, if you make more than 150,000 or 300,000 if joint fund together, you can't qualify for the credits. And the credit is assignable to the car dealer. In other words, if you don't have enough of a tax liability, you can use that tax credit as a point of sale, which is tremendous. And this also includes hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. I won't go into the commercial. There's also some tax credits for commercial vehicles, which is huge. And there are several studies out there that show the impact of the IRA on emission reductions. There's a Princeton repeat project. They all are aligned with the goal of reducing emissions, the Biden's goal. Princeton, Rhodium, and the Energy Innovation Group. I'm not going to go into details since we don't have time, but this is a really important one that I have to talk about, which is, what does the IRA really mean in terms of closing the emissions gap, right, between the current policy that we have and the 2030 climate target? So with the IRA, we have about a third of the emissions gap still needed, but we make up for 2/3 of this gap, 20% for transportation, power. Okay, so we still have a lot of work to do, but this is a huge step forward. It's not ideal, but it's going to get there. And the pie on the right showed the Build Better Act that never happened, but the emissions gap there was a little smaller, but we still have a really good chance of the IRA is a great help for our to reach our targets. And batteries also. Do I have time to talk about batteries?
No, we need to wrap up.
All right. Okay, so I'll send these slides around so people can look at the other issues. All right, let me stop sharing.
Okay. Yeah. So thanks so much, Cecilia. This has been very enlightening. Wish we had more time to talk about more of it, but we will make sure that your slides, we can put them on our website if you don't mind. So next we'll hear from Rahwa Ghirmatzion. And so Rahwa, you can go ahead and begin.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. Mark, thank you so much for inviting me. Maria, Cecilia, I just want to say thank you for that really comprehensive, I'm sure you could talk about it all day, work that you do. So a little bit about me. My name is Rahwa Ghirmatzion. I'm the Executive Director of People United for Sustainable Housing, or PUSH Buffalo. We are a community-based organization that has a very holistic theory of change and how we approach our work. So here I'm going to introduce, it'll be very colorful. So a little bit about Buffalo for a context setting is that Buffalo is the third poorest city in the nation, behind Detroit and Cleveland. We also have the second oldest housing stock in the nation. Those things mean something. The reason for that is they were built to last. More than 68% of our housing stock in the city is more than 100 years old. Unfortunately, while architecturally designed well and built well, much of our housing was built before insulation ever existed in a cold weather region. It has many household hazards, such as lead, which is one of our biggest issues. We have a much larger lead problem that disproportionately impacts poor and working class folk that are also BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. And we, of course, have an industrial past that has a lot of pollution in the air. So the inequities are deep, and as physicians, you know, because you work under the social determinants of health. And so those are the things that we are trying to address at Push Buffalo. So our framing is incredibly holistic, where we address a lot of these interventions through land and land use, as well as the intersections of racial, economic, and environmental justice. Next slide, please. So we begin with our theory of change. Our theory of change is called a just transition. How do we move away from an extractive economy, an economy whose worldview is rooted in the legacy of slavery and colonialism, has a consumer mindset, fossil fuel extraction, heteropatriarchy? I can go on and on, but I will not. I think you get the gist. Where our resources, unfortunately, where, you know, we live on a planet with finite resources, it's dig, burn, dump, it's incredibly linear. Our, you know, work oftentimes is exploited. Americans are working much longer hours, where we don't see the kind of increase of pay rate as inflation and the cost of goods. The purpose of this country is really just with the enclosure of wealth and power at the top, where 99% of the folks have basically 1% of the population has more than 50% of the nation's wealth. And our governance should be democratic, but unfortunately, more than half of the national budget goes towards military, so it's actually militarism. So all of these, this extractive worldview is creating the climate crisis that we currently exist in. And sadly, around the world, and certainly in the nation, the people who are disproportionately paying for the cost and you know, the impact of climate disruptions happen to be Black, Indigenous, other people of color, and poor people. They also contribute the least amount of harm to the planet that has caused the global climate crisis. And so what we would like to do is actually create a regenerative economy where it's rooted in exactly the work that you do, which is caring and sacredness and centering our humanity and the people. Our resources should be regenerative, meaning solar power, wind power, geothermal. Our work should be more cooperative. Our purpose should be about ecological and social well-being, and our governance should be about deep democracy. How do we do that? Because that seems like a huge sort of thing to do. A lot of it, you know, the granularity of which Maria Cecilia shared with you are some of the ways, but how we think about it in a big structural way is we need to draw the money down from the enclosure of the wealth up here down to the front lines or the community, the grassroots organizations. And our resource, and we do that through a values filter. So it's shifting economic control to communities. It's about democratizing work and wealth in the workplace. It is about, you know, addressing or advancing ecological restoration, driving racial and racial justice and social justice, relocalizing most production and consumption, as well as rooting in our natural indigenous cultures, and heritage. Next slide, please. All right, I'm going to make it super simple for you. How do we actually do that? How do we take that theory and put it into practice? Well, we are practicing in what we call the Green Development Zone. This is on the lower west side of Buffalo. We drew an arbitrary map about 15 years ago and said, this is going to be the 20 square block area where we're going to take holistic frameworks across the social determinants of health and actually begin to have intervention. So we organized the people, ask them to identify what are the challenges and barriers in their community. Then we turn those into policy, legislative goals. We won that, and we took all the money from those winnings, and we started to do the economic development intervention. So things like housing weatherization, renovating and rebuilding our housing stock, making sure that everything is affordable. Also, in this country, we know that health equals wealth. And so how do we make sure that there is people are able to earn more money, right? Upskill the people that are of and from these communities, mostly earning minimum wage jobs, to be able to earn family sustaining wages, pay time off, be treated with dignity as workers. How do we create more green space to address not only heat island effect, but also reduce people's stress levels, because we know green space will do that. How do we bring, think about food systems and having culturally significant food and using the land there for people to actually grow their own food. So it becomes more affordable. It's much more culturally competent. And next slide, please. Next slide. Thank you so much. And we do this by centering the people in these, what is called the low income community. Oftentimes, people say that you're poor, you're this, but actually we are real people that have real power, and we know what we want where we live. And the people that are closest to the problem, believe it or not, have the best solutions. How do I know this? Because it is these people, it's multiracial, intergenerational, really representing the community. We harness all of their local knowledge, their local expertise, and they help us co-design, whether it's housing or programs. Next slide, please. And just to give you a sense, here we are. So this gentleman right here to the right of me, where it says BNSC Push, it's one of our training houses. He was a 6-year-old that saw us renovate the house right across from his mom's house first, and he just watched us from the porch for many years. And as he got older, he actually became trained in how to renovate these homes, removing mold, asbestos, framing, putting in renewable energy sources like solar on the roof, installing heat pump technology within the houses, induction ovens, and so on and so forth. And he earns $20 an hour. And of course, he's training the next generation of men and women in our neighborhood. Brenda Herndon over there with the Push Buffalo sweatshirt. She was an organizer. She became an organizer with us. We were just knocking on her door and said, "Hey, ma'am, do you pay too much for your heating bills?" And she said, "Oh, let me sit here and tell you, her gas had been shut off right before winter." And so she had a big story to tell. She had a very powerful voice. So we said, "Okay, come on, you have a lived experience and you have a story to share with the world. So you're going to help us organize other people like you to address these issues." Next slide, please. And here's some of the ways that we do our planning and community congresses. We blow up these maps. We bring the experts who sit on the outside. These are usually urban planning students, housing clinic students, law students that are dealing in housing and urban planning to come work with us to do this high level charrettes and assessment. Next slide, please. Here's some more of that, how we actually plan and co-design spaces, from building parking spots, how many handicap spots, what kind of what is the look and feel of our buildings going to be. Next slide, please. And here are some folks that are putting them to work. So we use nature-based solutions to address our combined sewer overflow. What does that mean? It means during big heavy weather events, like it's happening in Jackson, and their water system being compromised with too much rain coming in, untreated raw sewage going into our freshwater lake, which is Lake Erie, the Buffalo River, the Niagara River, where people fish and recreate, mostly poor people and immigrants and refugees. Well, we would like for that to stop. So how do we capture the stormwater, not allowing it go into the sewer system, disconnect the downspout, and create rain gardens that bring, again, native plants. It brings a sense of more green space and greenery all around our community, adding to its beautification and reducing people's stress levels. But also, it really, for us, is a workforce strategy to create new sectors that are both addressing the ecological problem, but also creating good green jobs. You've got men and women here, folks that are coming out of prison, people that are chronically under or unemployed, youth who are not going on a college track for whatever reason, learning how to frame and redevelop these homes that now we are creating affordable housing for the people that are in our neighborhood, but they are being rebuilt by the people in our neighborhood. So it brings a sense of pride. And that pride alone is, trust me, believe it or not, keeping people from going into emergency rooms. We've got folks that are actually building solar on our rooftops. They did it for 20 Buffalo Public School students. This is actually one of our facilities where we have 30 senior affordable housing units, Push's headquarters, a theater company, a youth program. And you see they've installed solar on our roof so that the people that are living there, not only are they paying affordable rates, we actually reduce their economic burden even further by having solar on the roof so that they pay even cheaper. Push Green, that is our weatherization program. Part of our work is not just to weatherize the homes, but to educate our community. As soon as you get your home weatherized in Buffalo, you have a 30% savings off your gas bill. But more importantly, you have better quality livable housing. Oftentimes, especially during the pandemic, our big worry was so many people are living in housing that now our children are dealing with lead, having disruptions in the school that leads to the school to the prison pipeline. They have asbestos, they have mold, they have all kinds of other habitability issues in their homes. And now they are stuck and actually don't have any access to fresh air. Next slide, please. So here's just a few things that we've done. Here is a vacant house that's been vacant, the apartment's 40, 50 years. And we use the materials that we use are important to us of what we're bringing to our community. So we use metal roofs. They're recyclable at the end of their lives. They're better conductors in a cold weather region. That looks just like wood. We love the architecture in our city, but it's actually hardy board plank, which is cement based. It comes pre-painted, so we're not releasing toxins into our community, and they're better conductors. They last longer. And at the end of their life, when you have to demo this home, you can recycle that. And also all of the household materials, including we are beginning to decarbonize all of our buildings, meaning we only use electrified equipment in the homes, including induction ovens. If I have time, maybe in the Q&A, I'll talk to you a little bit about the fact that 40% of indoor household pollution comes from gas stoves. Which leads to asthma and all of these other health issues that you guys are much more familiar than I am. Next slide, please. Here's just a couple of, these are two training houses. The one on the bottom, the green one, is actually a net zero house. It means on an annualized basis, this house produces as much energy as it consumes. So it's got a whole geothermal system, it's got a solar system and all kinds of other systems. And it was built by 43 youth build students working with a lot of the trade unions and experts in the field. And then we completed that in 2010. Right next to it is another training house where 80 folks from the reentry population built that house. It has everything that net zero house has, except for the geothermal system, just because it was really, really expensive. And this was done in 2016 prior to heat pumps that are now becoming much more affordable, and that we're also transitioning all of our homes, taking out all of the gas burning infrastructure to heat pumps, which provide not only heating and efficient heating, but also provide cooling in the summer. And with the climate disruptions going up and down, it is especially important for our vulnerable populations, our elders, and our young babies. Next slide, please. I will answer that question in a moment. And then here are the benefits of using green infrastructure to address, again, the combined sewer overflow that I was talking about. We build rain gardens, green roofs, vegetated swales, permeable pavers, parking pads. And we'll show you a few of what those look like. Next slide, please. Here we are. So we've got the permeable parking pads. You've got these beautiful rain gardens that we put in between homes. We've got cisterns that we capture that storm water, that we sink underground, that are sometimes above ground. And there's that beautiful community garden where this is one of two large ones that we have. It has 28 plots, 10 by 10. And you see several generations of farmers that are growing their own food. We have a lot of African, Burmese, and other immigrants. There are about 86 languages spoken at my son's international school. Next slide, please. This is a school building that we renovated. Developers were looking at it to turn it into high rent loft apartments. The community said, we do not want that. We want Push to take over. Next slide, please. After 4 years of planning, this is what we converted it to, planning it with our community members. 30 beautiful, affordable senior units, a 64 kilowatt solar system. It's got a living roof on the roof of it. There's a pocket park that we designed. Our focus group were 5-year-olds to 12-year-olds, and they designed a beautiful little park. And the entire system is eco landscape. And we trained 16 to 21-year-olds in green infrastructure, and actually several of them took the test and got their National Green Infrastructure Certification Program. Next slide, please. Here's again, folks installing the roof. These are men and women. Next slide. Here's the green roof that I told you about. What's really interesting is we co-design a lot of things with the stakeholders. So seniors, right? Those are recycled tires. You can pick them up and they're very soft, but if they fall, our elders, that means they're falling on something soft. Next slide, please. So here's just a little bit of our impact, what you can do with the types of targeted investments and working within a 20-40 square block area. Next slide, please. We're also educating the next generations. The next slide, which is my last slide. And thank you very much. I'm all set.
Great. Thank you so much, Rahwa. Now we'll take questions from the audience. I remind you that you can type questions in the chat box and we'll get to as many of them as we can. And we'll ask you to please take a moment to fill out the webinar survey. The link for the survey is now in the chat. So let's start. Let's see, Cecilia, if you can come back. Jordan, why don't we take some questions? Jordan, what questions do we have for Cecilia and Rahwa?
Sure. Cecilia, are you there?
Yeah, somehow it says that I can't start my video.
Oh, let me see if maybe it's something that I did.
Okay. While we're getting Cecilia set up, we can begin. Thank you both for those presentations. Rahwa, I wanted to come to you with some of the initial questions that we got. First, could you speak about the broader societal vision you are outlining ever being achievable within a capitalist economy?
Man, what a great question. That's a big one. So yes, it is possible. Time is running out. The window is really closing. So much of what Maria Cecilia talked about, but what is really important right now and how I think physicians can help us is that you guys are evidence-based and really very much into science. So really helping us get these stories and narratives out there, right? But I think the other thing that you have to do is exactly what New York State has done. New York State has now surpassed California in passing the most ambitious climate legislation that is economy-wide. The IRA is going to help us. The IRA is not perfect. There's some bad things in it for some folks, especially in Louisiana and the Gulf South and Alaska. But for the rest of the other places, especially like New York State and folks that have pretty advanced climate legislation policy, it's going to help us transition more quickly than what was possible prior to that. But New York has to actually transition 100% to 1990 levels by 2050 economy-wide, and 100% the electric sector by 2040. And that's every sector.
Great. More questions, Jordan?
Sure. Cecilia, I wanted to raise a question for you just about, you spoke so much about the electrification of vehicles. And currently with the heat waves that we've seen in the West, there's been a large push around folks needing to conserve the amount of energy that they're using on the grid, fears that there could be, outages. And so I'm wondering if you can speak to what is being done / what needs to be done for the future as we're trying to bring more energy onto the grid.
Okay, that's a very good question, and there's no doubt that we need to improve our power grid significantly, and even without electrification, that's something that needs to be done. For instance, remember what happened in Texas? That was a very serious situation that was avoidable if only we had a better transmission system. So we need to invest seriously in linking the various regions so that we can use each other's energy when seasonal issues and other reasons for, especially now with climate change, right? We're going into uncharted waters, right? We don't really know what the weather is going to be like. We're going to get more extreme events, and we're already getting them. So it's extremely important to the climate resilience of our grid is super important, regardless of vehicle electrification. Now, with electrical vehicle electrification, then it becomes even more important, right? Because we are going to, Americans drive, and so by 2050, actually before that, we're not going to be able to buy combustion engines anymore by 2035, hopefully. So we need to improve both our generation and our transmission. And the utilities have a big role to play there, but also government planning, right? And the good news is that the amount, we know exactly how much capacity we need. It's formidable, but the cost is feasible, right? It's the cost of the extra capacity and the extra transmission has been worked out in great detail by state. And there are studies, and we did one of them, that show that it's unbelievably, the cost is unbelievably within reach, right? So it's not going to be an easy path, but it is possible. It's not
Great.
something impossible, but many people think that electrification is going to completely gut our power grid. That's not true.
Okay, great. Yeah, so while you're talking about cost, I'm interested in having Rahwa to talk about cost for the things that she does, and how are these accessible to low-income people?
That's a really good question. The cost, especially right now with the supply chain craziness and what have you, has been a little bit challenging, more challenging than before. We are able to do what we do specifically for low income folks is, we are passing policies that are creating funding sources through state agencies. For example, the weatherization program. We have NYSERDA, which is the New York State Energy Research Dormitory Authority. I can't believe I got that. So they have millions and millions of dollars that have affordability programs that are targeting low income folks. So for example, if you're so low income where you're like 40%, 30% below AMI, you get automatic free weatherization. So there's a program called Empower. That is some legislation we help pass. Others, it doesn't matter what your income is. If you qualify under a certain threshold, I believe 80% below AMI and under, you qualify for a low income interest rate. So like I said, you save 30% immediately. It's that savings that you pay back. And it takes about 6 or 7 years for folks to pay that back. There are new programs now for heat pumps. There's a pretty good incentive program where the state will pay 30% of it. So, a heat pump in an average home can cost you anywhere between $9,000 to $14,000. But if you get a $3,000 to $4,000 rebate, that's really helpful, right? So if you have to get a new furnace, our recommendation is you get a new heat pump because, as I said, it provides both heating and cooling. The bad thing is there will be an increase in your utility bill, even though you're not paying gas anymore. So what we're trying to do is also create better incentives for people to get rooftop solar or be able to invest in what is known as community solar, where we build large solar farms and you invest in that and you get the credits where you live. So it's not none of this is linear, but there are different ways that people can access these resources. Also, yes, the kind of housing that we do, you do have to income qualify. We basically, as a developer, rather than, our bottom line is not to generate revenue. Our bottom line is to basically benefit the community. So unlike other developers, we don't really take a big developer fee. We use that developer fee and reinvest it in better quality housing. And we try to build to the 100-year mark.
Right. Yeah, and I really like the way that you integrate a lot of different programs that people may not know about and sort of package them and bring them together for individual um, homeowners or renters. Jordan, can you give us the next question, please?
Yes, this next one's for Cecilia. The comment is, the question first and then the comment attached. Does Union of Concerned Scientists support liquid biofuels is the question. And they just shared that burning any kind of fuel creates NO2, which is harmful to the health and also increases ozone, which is also harmful to health. It also creates a particulate. So with that in mind, does UCS support liquid biofuels?
Okay, that's a very good question. And as I showed you, by 2050, we're still going to have about almost 20%, actually it's a little less, of the current use of liquid fuels. So even with electrification and efficiency, we're still going to have those hard to decarbonize areas, right? So we're cornered, right? We absolutely need to have, I mean, we still need our long distance shipping and our jet fuel. So we look at it very cautiously. So biofuels can be made from a variety of sources, variety of processes. So I wouldn't say that we're totally against them, but what I would say quite definitely is that synthetic fuels are probably a more interesting way of addressing these hard to decarbonize sectors. And again, because you can control, the source of hydrogen, and you're not using, agriculture. You're not using any kind of crop. That said, remember also that the use of gasoline is going to go down, and so we're also going to have less ethanol. So we're not going to be using corn to produce ethanol anymore. But we do not want we do not want to have energy crops that will compete with food in any way. And then as to the environmental effects of biofuels, it's also there are also issues there that can be addressed. So the small amount of biofuels that will probably be needed have to be done very carefully. But generally, we prefer to go in the direction of synthetic fuels. Yes.
So yeah, I know that this discussion can go on a lot longer. There's a lot to discuss. There are a lot of questions. So we really appreciate this, but we really need to wrap up. So I want to thank our speakers and thank all of you for participating in this webinar series. And I hope that you found it useful. As a reminder, these webinars are held on the second Friday of the month. The next webinar is scheduled for October 14th, and the topic is mental health. Before you leave, we'd like to ask you to take a moment to complete the webinar survey if you haven't already. Again, the link is in the chat. Support for our webinar series is made possible with funding from Johnson & Johnson, the Energy Foundation, the American Medical Association, and the American College of Physicians. Thanks to our sponsors, and thanks to our audience for listening. This now concludes our session. Have a great day.